The death game genre is really interesting and exciting. Pulls you in right away and keeps you watching. These stories usually place characters in intense situations where every choice matters. The games are dangerous, the rules are strict, and one mistake can change everything. What makes this genre so fun to watch is the tension. You never know who will survive or what will happen next. Each challenge feels bigger than the last, and the pressure keeps rising as the story goes on. There are plenty of awesome movies and shows in the death game genre. Each one brings its own twist, whether it focuses on strategy, teamwork, betrayal, or survival. Some are emotional, some are shocking, and others make you think about human nature. That mix of action, mystery, and drama is why the death game genre continues to grow and attract so many fans. Squid Game is a show about people who are struggling with money and have nowhere else to turn. They are invited to compete in a series of games for a huge cash prize. At first, the games seem harmless and familiar, but they quickly turn deadly. As the players fight to survive, the show explores how far people will go when pushed to their limits. Alice in Borderland is a show where players wake up in an abandoned city and must compete in life or death games. Each game has different rules and dangers. Some focus on strength while others test the mind. Survival depends on how fast they learn and who they choose to trust. The Hunger Games franchise is about a future world where the government forces young people to fight to the death. Each year, one boy and one girl from every district are chosen to compete in a deadly event called the Hunger Games. Only one person can survive, and the battles are broadcast for everyone to watch. Battle Royale is a film series about a group of students who are forced by the government to take part in a deadly game. They are sent to a remote island and given weapons. The only rule is that they must kill each other until only one person remains alive. Ready or Not is a movie where a young woman marries into a wealthy family. What should be the happiest night of her life quickly turns into a nightmare. On her wedding night, she is told she must take part in a family tradition. That tradition is a deadly game of hide and seek. As the game begins, the family arms themselves and starts hunting her throughout their massive mansion. She must stay hidden, think fast, and fight to survive until morning. If she is found, she will be killed. What follows is a tense night filled with fear, chaos, and non-stop suspense. The Cube movies are about a group of strangers who wake up trapped inside a massive maze made of cube-shaped rooms. Each room looks the same, but many of them are filled with deadly traps. One wrong step can mean instant death. As the group moves through the maze, they must work together to survive. Some rooms require math skills, others require logic, and some are dangerous with no warning at all. Tension grows as fear sets in and trust begins to fall apart. The movies focus on survival, teamwork, and the panic that comes from being trapped with no clear way out. With every room they enter, the danger increases and escape feels more impossible. When it comes to anime, there are also plenty of great shows. Many of them take the death game idea and add unique worlds, creative rules, and emotional stories. These anime often mix action, suspense, and strong characters that make every episode exciting. Platinum End is a show about people who are chosen by angels to compete for the role of the next god. Each person is given special powers and must face others chosen for the same reason. The battles are deadly, and only one can win. The Future Diary is a show about people who are given phones that can predict the future. Each diary shows events in a different way. The players are forced into a deadly survival game where the last person alive becomes a god. Killing Bites is a show where humans and animal hybrids are forced to fight in brutal battles. These fighters use the strength and instincts of animals to defeat their enemies. The matches are violent and only the strongest survive. Although Sword Art Online does count as a death game anime, it completely fails in this regard. The show has a strong idea but wastes it almost right away. The danger never feels real, and the rules stop matching. Characters survive for no reason, and the story quickly loses tension. Instead of focusing on fear and survival, the show turns boring and messy. The pacing is bad, the writing is weak, and the stakes feel fake. What should be intense becomes dull. Overall, Sword Art Online is terrible and awful. It takes a great concept and turns it into something disappointing and forgettable. In this video, we will talk about why Sword Art Online is a terrible death game anime. For starters, the death game part of Sword Art Online is completely voluntary. No one is forced to fight. No one is dragged into danger. Players choose to leave the safe zone on their own free will. They choose to risk their lives. They can stay inside the safe zone forever and nothing will happen to them. The game does not push them out. It does not punish them for hiding. It does not threaten them. If they never step outside, they are guaranteed to survive. Dying is not unavoidable. Death only happens because players decide to chase levels, gear, or pride. Every single death comes from choice, not necessity. The game gives them a perfect escape route and many of them ignore it. Complaining about being trapped loses all weight when safety is always right there. They are not victims of the system. They are victims of their own decisions. Once you realize this, the entire death game idea falls apart. Stops being scary and starts being a joke. Nothing forces anyone to die. The danger only exists because people walk straight into it. Every player who dies does so by their own choice. They were not trapped. They were not cornered. They were careless. Every death in the game was completely avoidable. All they had to do was stay in the safe zone and they would still be alive. Instead, they ran toward fights they did not need to take. They chased progress like it mattered more than their lives. That is not a tragedy. That is stupidity. The game does not kill people. Bad decisions do. Anyone who dies has no one to blame but themselves. The so-called death game only works because players keep making the dumbest choices possible. There are literally no stakes and no real risk. The danger only exists if someone chooses to walk into it. Nothing bad happens if players stay where they are. The safe zone protects them completely. No monsters can touch them. No one can kill them. Survival is guaranteed. The smartest choice is obvious. Stay in the safe zone and do nothing. There is no reason to fight. No reason to grind. No reason to play hero. Leaving safety is not brave. It is reckless and pointless. Anyone who steps outside is choosing danger for no reward. The game does not demand action. It does not force progress. Risk only exists for people who ignore the safest and smartest option right in front of them. This is exactly why Sword Art Online fails as a death game story. A real death game forces people to fight to stay alive. There is no escape and no safe choice. Survival requires action. Standing still means death. Sword Art Online does the opposite. Players are allowed to sit around and do nothing. They can hide forever and still live. The story calls it a death game, but it never fully commits to that idea. There is no pressure. There is no urgency. There is no true threat. Other death game shows make survival impossible without risk. The characters must move forward or die. In Sword Art Online, they can avoid everything and be completely fine. That alone destroys the entire premise. When guaranteed survival exists, the death game stops being a death game at all. The safe zone removes fear entirely. Fear only works when danger cannot be escaped. But in this world, there is always a place where nothing can hurt you. The moment things get uncomfortable, players can retreat and be perfectly fine. A death game is supposed to make every moment feel unsafe. Yet the existence of guaranteed protection turns fear into something temporary and optional. Urgency disappears for the same reason. There is no ticking clock and no pressure forcing players to move forward. They are not starving, running out of time, or being hunted. They can wait months or even years without consequence. When nothing bad happens if you do nothing, the story loses momentum and survival stops mattering. Tension also collapses because escape is always possible. Every dangerous moment loses impact when retreat is an option. Fights stop feeling life or death because the characters can simply run away. Viewers know this too, which drains suspense from scenes that are meant to feel intense. The presence of safety prevents true desperation from ever forming. Death game stories rely on people being pushed to their mental and emotional limits. Here, comfort always exists in the background. Characters are never forced into panic or impossible situations. They are not fighting because they must, but because they choose to. Because of this, heroism loses its meaning. Risk is never required. Anyone who leaves the safe zone is doing so voluntarily. Bravery only matters when danger cannot be avoided, and here it always can be. Choosing risk when survival is guaranteed is not heroic. It is optional recklessness. Progress stops being about survival and starts feeling like a hobby. Leveling up, clearing floors, and gathering gear should be necessities. Instead, they become side activities. Players are not advancing because their lives depend on it, but because they want to. The main objective loses all weight when ignoring it keeps you alive just as well. The story even allows players to abandon the main goal entirely with no punishment. They can refuse to fight, refuse to progress, and still survive forever. A death game cannot function when participation is optional. If doing nothing works, then the objective itself becomes meaningless. This also makes the threat feel empty. He claims everyone is trapped and doomed unless the game is cleared, yet the system he created already provides permanent safety. If players can live comfortably forever, then the threat is exaggerated at best and dishonest at worst. The story undermines its own antagonist. The safe zone splits the players into two groups. A small number of fighters take all the risks while everyone else waits safely in town. The danger is no longer shared. A true death game places everyone under the same pressure, not just a handful of volunteers. Deaths lose emotional impact because they were never inevitable. Knowing a character could have survived by staying in safety makes their death feel pointless rather than tragic. Instead of grief, the audience is left wondering why the character chose danger at all. Moral conflict is weakened as well. Death game stories usually force characters into terrible choices where every option has consequences. Here, those choices rarely exist. No one is forced to kill or be killed. Safety removes the ethical weight that defines the genre. Teamwork also becomes less meaningful. Cooperation is not required to live. Players can survive alone simply by avoiding danger. Bonds feel weaker when people are not relying on one another to stay alive. Sacrifice suffers for the same reason. Sacrificial moments only matter when they prevent unavoidable death. In this world, death is avoidable from the start. Giving your life to save others feels unnecessary when those lives were never truly at risk. The idea of being trapped falls apart entirely. The story insists the players are imprisoned, yet they have homes, protection, stability, and peace. Being trapped should mean constant danger and suffering. Comfort directly contradicts that idea. Because of all this, the world stops feeling like a death game at all. It becomes a normal video game with extreme penalties for mistakes. Death is not built into the system. It only happens when players choose to gamble with their lives. When guaranteed safety exists, the death game premise collapses completely. The story would have been far better if players could only stay in the safe zone for a limited amount of time. That single change would have fixed most of the problems. Safety would no longer be permanent. Players would not be able to hide forever. Eventually, everyone would be forced back into danger. With a time limit, real fear would finally exist. Players would have to think ahead instead of sitting around comfortably. They would need to manage resources, plan routes, and decide when it was worth risking combat. Every moment spent resting would matter. Danger would stop being optional. Characters could not avoid the game by doing nothing. If they stayed idle too long, they would be pushed back into the world whether they liked it or not. Survival would depend on action, not choice. This would create real tension. Time would become the enemy. Players would constantly weigh safety against progress. Waiting too long would be just as deadly as reckless fighting. Planning would actually matter. Groups would need schedules, supply runs, and clear goals. Mistakes would have consequences. Poor planning could kill someone just as easily as a monster. Most importantly, it would restore the death game premise. Players would not be living comfortably inside a fake prison. They would be under constant pressure, knowing that safety was temporary and danger unavoidable. That alone would have made Sword Art Online feel like a real survival story instead of a game people could simply choose not to play. The only reason the characters do not stay in the safe zone forever is because the show would be boring if everyone just sat around doing nothing. That is it. There is no story reason strong enough to push them out. The world does not force action. The game does not punish waiting. The plot simply needs movement. If this were real, no sane person would leave. Sitting in the safe zone would be the smartest and safest choice possible. It guarantees survival. There is no reward worth risking death when safety is permanent. The characters leave town not because they must, but because the writers need them to. Their decisions are driven by the needs of the show, not by logic inside the world. That makes the danger feel artificial. When the smartest option is to do nothing, but the characters act anyway, the story stops feeling real. It becomes obvious that people are walking into danger only so the plot can continue. That is not tension. That is the story forcing stupidity to exist so something happens. You do not care about anyone who dies in Sword Art Online because every death is completely their own fault. None of them were forced into danger. None of them had no choice. If they had stayed inside the safe zone, they would still be alive, guaranteed. Deaths in this world are not tragic. They are the result of bad decisions, carelessness, and stupidity. There is no suspense, no heartbreak, no real loss, just people walking straight into problems they could have avoided. When survival is always available, dying is purely optional. That means sympathy feels hollow. Every death is a reminder that the characters chose to gamble with their lives for no reason, and the audience is left shaking their heads instead of feeling grief. The story asks you to care, but it gives you no reason. Safety existed the whole time. Every death could have been prevented with the simplest choice. That turns the so-called tragedy into pure nonsense. The show is also afraid to kill off important characters. Everyone who actually dies is someone we barely know, maybe a character introduced in the same episode or just a few scenes earlier. There is no attachment, no emotional investment, and no real stakes. I will give you $100 if you can tell me the name of all of the Moonlit Black Cats members without cheating or looking it up. This completely undermines the death game premise. A true survival story only works when the audience cares about the people in danger. When only background characters or throwaways die, the tension disappears. No one fears for the main cast because the show protects them at all costs. Sword Art Online pretends to have life or death consequences, but in reality, it shields the characters we are supposed to care about. Death becomes meaningless and hollow, reducing the supposedly high-stakes story to a cheap, empty spectacle. The characters in this show are unbelievably dumb. They constantly charge into battle without thinking things through or considering the consequences. For example, the lieutenant colonel in the Aincrad Liberation Force decides to attack the Gleam Eyes boss with his team even though they are exhausted and completely unprepared. This kind of reckless behavior makes the story feel absurd. The death game premise only works if characters act like people fighting for their lives, making careful decisions and planning their moves. Instead, the characters behave like fools, throwing themselves at danger for no good reason. Their stupidity robs the show of tension and credibility. Every fight could have been avoided with logic or strategy, yet the plot rewards reckless action instead of careful planning. Sword Art Online pretends to be high stakes, but the constant bad decisions of the characters make it impossible to take any of the danger seriously. Another problem is that the rules of the death game keep changing. In the first episode, the creator makes it clear, there is no way to revive anyone. If a player dies in the game, they die in real life. That is supposed to set the stakes, to make every fight and every decision terrifying. But by episode 3, the story suddenly introduces a revival item. Just like that, someone can cheat death. The rules the show spent time building are contradicted within days. What was supposed to be permanent and absolute suddenly becomes optional. This makes the danger feel fake. You cannot take the threats seriously when the rules are inconsistent. One moment death is final. The next, it can be undone. The show destroys its own tension by shifting the stakes whenever it suits the plot. It turns the death game into a story where nothing really matters. The revival item eliminates permanent consequences. Death is supposed to be final, the ultimate punishment. When the revival item exists, nothing truly matters. Every fight, every choice, and every risk loses weight because failure can always be undone. Players no longer have to fear the worst, and the story stops feeling serious. The revival item removes fear of failure. The tension in a death game comes from knowing that mistakes are deadly. With a revival item, players can act recklessly without thinking, knowing they will always have a second chance. The constant anxiety that makes a death game gripping disappears. The revival item cheapens sacrifice. Moments where characters risk their lives to save others or achieve something heroic are supposed to sting. When revival exists, all those acts are pointless. Bravery is no longer brave. Selflessness is no longer noble. Dramatic tension is turned into pointless fluff. The revival item undermines suspense. The audience can never trust that a character is truly in danger. Every death could be undone at any moment. That makes climactic battles, tense escapes, and risky plans feel hollow because viewers know nothing is permanent. The revival item destroys moral stakes. Death games often force impossible decisions where every choice has dire consequences. If revival exists, those moral dilemmas vanish. Killing, sacrificing, or protecting someone loses meaning because death is no longer real. Choices stop mattering, and the story loses its ethical weight. The revival item encourages reckless behavior. Players no longer need to calculate risk or think carefully. If they make a mistake, revival will fix it. Characters who should be cautious act carelessly instead, and tension evaporates. The story rewards stupidity instead of punishing it, making danger feel fake. The revival item makes strategy pointless. Planning, risk assessment, and tactical thinking are hallmarks of a survival story. Revival destroys that. No strategy truly matters when mistakes can be reversed. Every clever move loses significance because players can just recover from failure. The revival item breaks immersion. A death game only works if the consequences of death are absolute. When revival exists, the world stops feeling real. The audience knows that nothing is truly at stake, which turns a supposed survival nightmare into a normal video game where mistakes are no longer meaningful. The revival item creates inconsistency in the story. Characters react to danger, make tense choices, and experience fear as if death is permanent. Yet revival completely contradicts those reactions. Their emotions feel fake, forced, and inconsistent because the rules of the world keep shifting. The revival item shifts focus from survival to convenience. The story is no longer about staying alive. It becomes about using items to undo mistakes. Players are rewarded for ignoring danger instead of facing it. The survival aspect of the game disappears entirely. The revival item undermines the threat of the villain. The whole point of the antagonist is to make the players feel trapped and at risk of death. Revival items make that threat meaningless. No matter how much the villain claims danger is everywhere, players have a built-in safety net that destroys tension. The revival item makes emotional stakes hollow. Death is supposed to be shocking and devastating. Revival items make grief pointless. The audience cannot truly mourn the death of a character because they know it can be reversed. Emotional moments lose all impact, and the story feels shallow. The most baffling part is how the revival item is never actually used in the show. It is introduced as if it matters, then disappears completely. The story sets it up like it could change the rules of survival, but once it exists, the writers act as if it never does. This makes the plot feel careless and inconsistent. The revival item could have saved characters, altered conflicts, or changed the stakes entirely, but the show ignores it. Introducing a powerful tool and then forgetting it destroys tension because the audience knows the rules are arbitrary. By never using it, the story undercuts itself twice. First, the revival item invalidates danger, and then the writers pretend it does not exist at all. Viewers are left wondering why it was introduced in the first place, making the entire narrative feel sloppy and meaningless. Death is supposed to matter, but the revival item proves the writers never intended for it to matter. Threats, tension, and stakes are all hollow because the tools to erase them are casually ignored. The story cannot claim to be a real death game when it keeps ignoring one of the most powerful survival mechanics it ever created. A major issue in Sword Art Online is that the death game is not even the main focus of the show. The story constantly shifts away from survival and danger to follow slice-of-life moments and romantic subplots. The supposed death game feels like an afterthought, a backdrop for characters wandering around, talking, and flirting. This completely undermines the premise. A death game should put constant pressure on characters, force tough choices, and make every moment tense. Instead, the show treats life or death stakes like optional scenery. Characters spend more time chatting in inns or exploring romance than actually trying to survive. The audience cannot take the danger seriously because the narrative does not. When the focus is on trivial drama instead of life and death survival, tension evaporates. The story constantly reminds viewers that death is optional, trivial, or irrelevant, which destroys the impact of the death game label entirely. By prioritizing romance and slice-of-life elements over survival, Sword Art Online fails as a true death game story. The life and death premise exists only to provide setting, not stakes. The result is a story that pretends danger matters while constantly ignoring it. Imagine if Squid Game was treated like a romance show, with the death game only existing for fun or background drama. That would be ridiculous, right? The tension, fear, and stakes that make it gripping would disappear instantly. Every life or death moment would feel meaningless if the story spent more time on love triangles and casual conversations than actual survival. Well, that is exactly what Sword Art Online does. The death game is supposed to be the core of the story, but instead it feels like a side hobby while romance and slice-of-life nonsense take center stage. Every serious threat is diluted because the narrative refuses to treat survival as the main focus. The result is absurd. What should be terrifying becomes background scenery. Life or death stakes are ignored or trivialized, and viewers are left watching characters flirt or wander aimlessly, while the death game exists only in name. Sword Art Online pretends to be a survival story, but in reality, it is just a romance show with a fake backdrop of danger. The funniest part is that after 14 episodes, the death game premise is completely abandoned. The story spends all that time pretending survival matters, building up tension that never actually pays off, and then drops it entirely. Suddenly, Sword Art Online moves on to new arcs that have nothing to do with the death game, as if the entire first half never existed. This makes the series feel even more pointless. Viewers are led to believe they are watching a life or death survival story, only to realize that the danger, the stakes, and the so-called death game were never the real focus. The story abandons the tension it spent episodes trying to create, leaving the survival aspect hollow and irrelevant. By completely ignoring the death game after the initial setup, the show proves it never cared about being a survival story. All the danger, all the risks, and all the supposedly high-stakes moments were just window dressing. Sword Art Online treats the death game like a gimmick, tossing it aside as soon as it wants to explore completely unrelated storylines. Why even call the show Sword Art Online when the actual Sword Art Online game is only a tiny fraction of the entire franchise? Most of the story takes place in other games, other worlds, and other arcs that have nothing to do with the original death game. The title promises a focus on one thing, but delivers something entirely different. That is like calling Alice in Borderland tag, just because one of the many deadly games involves chasing each other, while the rest of the series features completely unrelated challenges. The title sets up expectations that the story never fulfills, misleading viewers about what the show is actually about. This creates confusion and disappointment. Fans drawn in by the promise of a high-stakes, life-or-death survival game are instead treated to side plots, romance, and unrelated adventures. The so-called Sword Art Online part exists mostly in name, not in substance, and the show abandons the very thing its title claims to be about. Sword Art Online is a complete bait and switch. The show promises a high-stakes, life-or-death survival story where every choice matters and every death counts. The title, the setup, and the first few episodes all suggest a tense death game. What it actually delivers is almost the opposite. The danger is optional, deaths are avoidable or meaningless, revival items exist and are ignored, and the focus constantly shifts to romance, slice-of-life moments, and unrelated adventures. Everything that makes a true death game gripping is either trivialized or abandoned entirely. The result is frustration and disappointment. Viewers are led to expect intensity, suspense, and real consequences, but instead get a story that pretends danger exists while actively ignoring it. Sword Art Online does not just fail as a survival story, it betrays its own premise, trading tension for shallow drama and wasted potential. We were promised 100 floors in total, and yet the story ends prematurely on floor 75. The plot skips huge portions of the game, pretending progress is happening while we barely see any of it. In reality, we only actually witness about 10 floors because the story constantly fast-forwards and ignores most of the journey. This destroys the sense of scale and achievement that a true death game should have. Climbing floors is supposed to feel like a grueling, high-stakes process, but instead it feels rushed and incomplete. The audience never experiences the full struggle or danger the players are supposed to face. By cutting corners like this, Sword Art Online cheapens its own premise. The world is supposed to be massive and terrifying, but the story gives us almost nothing. What should have been a long, tense climb through countless challenges turns into a fragmentary, unsatisfying mess. You could argue that they are trying to reboot the premise with the progressive series, but the problem is that those stories are prequels. We already know who lives and who dies, which completely destroys any tension. There is no uncertainty, no real stakes, and no sense of danger because the audience is aware of the outcome before anything even happens. This makes the death game feel pointless. Survival and risk only matter if the outcome is unknown. When we already know the main characters survive, every fight and challenge loses its weight. The story cannot make us fear for the life of anyone, no matter how dramatic the scene is. By relying on prequels, the franchise cannot fix the core problem of Sword Art Online. The death game premise remains hollow, and the sense of suspense that should define the story is entirely absent. Everything is just background drama in a story where the audience already knows who will make it out alive. The most confusing part is that the progressive series is supposed to take a floor-by-floor approach instead of rushing through everything like the original. This should have been their chance to actually show the struggle, danger, and high-stakes tension of the death game. And yet, by the second movie, they are already skipping several floors since one of the overarching stories in the light novel is not finished yet. The story promises a detailed, methodical climb, but then abandons that plan almost immediately. What should have been a slow, suspenseful grind through each challenge turns into the same rushed, hollow pacing as before. The franchise gets a second chance to fix the problems of the original series, and it wastes it again. The floor-by-floor premise that could have restored danger and suspense is ignored, leaving the audience with the same lack of tension, rushed storytelling, and meaningless death game that made Sword Art Online a disappointment in the first place. It is obvious the writer did not plan anything about the death game, and he never set out to actually write a survival story. The life or death aspect exists only as a background prop, a setup to make the world seem dangerous while the real focus is on romance, slice-of-life moments, and unrelated plotlines. The lack of planning shows in every inconsistency. Rules keep changing, revival items appear and disappear, threats that should be terrifying are ignored, and characters constantly act in ways that make no sense for people supposedly fighting for their lives. Nothing in the story behaves like a real death game because the writer never intended it to. The result is a story that pretends to be high stakes and tense while never committing to danger, consequences, or survival. Sword Art Online uses the death game as scenery, not as the core of the narrative. Everything else, romance, drama, and side arcs, overrides the premise, proving the survival story was never the goal. Even when characters do die in the game, they do not actually die in real life. The supposed life or death stakes vanish the moment death turns out to be meaningless. For example, in the final episode of the arc, Kirito and Asuna are both killed in-game, yet they survive without consequence. This completely destroys any sense of danger or tension. If the main characters can die and still come back, then no one is ever truly at risk. Death stops being final, suspense disappears, and the audience has no reason to care about what happens to anyone. The show pretends to punish failure, but in reality, death is just a temporary setback. Moments that are supposed to be dramatic and heartbreaking lose all weight because survival is guaranteed for the important characters. Sword Art Online claims to be a death game, but in practice, dying does not matter at all. The show just changes its own rules whenever it feels like it. Nothing in Sword Art Online is consistent. Revival items appear and disappear, characters survive impossible deaths, and the supposed threats of the game vanish whenever the plot demands. This makes the story completely unreliable. The audience cannot take any danger seriously because the rules are not fixed. One moment death is permanent. The next it can be reversed. Tension collapses every time the writers ignore logic to suit the story. By constantly rewriting its own rules, the show undermines everything it claims to be. Sword Art Online cannot be considered a real death game because the rules are never stable, and danger exists only when the plot wants it to. Everything else is just arbitrary chaos. And having 10,000 characters in total is way too much. The story tries to juggle an overwhelming number of players, most of whom the audience never meets or cares about. As a result, the death game feels shallow, because there is no way to build meaningful stakes or emotional attachment to anyone. It would have been a lot better if the focus was on a small, manageable group of characters. That way, each death could carry weight, every decision could feel important, and the audience could actually care about who survives and who dies. Instead, Sword Art Online spreads its attention too thin, making the supposedly high-stakes survival story meaningless and impossible to invest in. Most of the characters are not real characters at all. They exist only as background props or statistics to make the total death count look higher. The story never develops them, gives them personalities, or makes the audience care about what happens to them. This makes the death game completely hollow. When someone dies, there is no shock, no grief, and no tension, because these players were never people we cared about in the first place. Their deaths are meaningless numbers on a scoreboard, not dramatic moments with real stakes. Sword Art Online pretends that thousands of lives are at risk, but in reality, almost all of those deaths are irrelevant. The story sacrifices real emotion and suspense just to inflate the illusion of danger, making the entire death game feel shallow and empty. Having 10,000 players in total does not make any sense to begin with. If this is supposed to be a massive virtual reality game, selling only 10,000 copies would be an enormous flop. A game like this would cost billions to develop, with cutting-edge technology, massive servers, and advanced VR hardware. The math does not add up. A company would never invest that much money and release it to such a tiny audience. The idea that only a handful of people would be playing makes the entire premise feel absurd and poorly thought out. Sword Art Online pretends this is a massive, world-changing game, but the numbers make it clear the scenario is unrealistic. The story builds tension and stakes around something that could never happen in reality, which makes the so-called death game feel even more ridiculous. It would have been far better if this was just the beta test, and a select group of players were invited to try it out and then got trapped in the game. Similar to what happened in the movie The Call Up. That setup would make the scenario much more believable. A small, controlled group makes sense for an experimental billion-dollar VR system, and it would allow the story to focus on real survival stakes. With a limited group, every character could be developed, every death would matter, and the tension would actually feel real. The audience could care about who lives and who dies, and the death game would feel meaningful instead of arbitrary. Instead, Sword Art Online spreads itself across 10,000 players, most of whom are irrelevant, making the stakes hollow. A beta test gone wrong would have created a tighter, more believable, and far more gripping survival story, instead of the sprawling, inconsistent mess we got. The premise of Sword Art Online does not even work. The show claims the nerve gear can destroy the brain of a player by emitting high-powered microwave signals, turning the helmet into a deadly, life-or-death device. That is supposed to make the stakes terrifying and inescapable. In reality, as one user on Reddit calculated, the nerve gear could not kill a player fast enough to actually be a threat. The mechanics do not add up. If someone simply takes the helmet off, they are fine. The supposed ultimate danger is easily avoidable, which destroys any sense of real risk or urgency. This makes the entire survival premise laughable. The technology that is supposed to trap players and force them to fight for their lives is fundamentally flawed. Sword Art Online pretends danger exists, but in reality, the deadliest threat in the game could be neutralized with the simplest action. The show sets up life-or-death stakes, then undermines them with logic that does not hold. The players do not even need to stay inside the safe zones. All they have to do is take the helmet off in the real world. It is that simple. Survival is guaranteed without risking a single fight or stepping outside. The death game instantly collapses under the simplest, most obvious solution. This completely destroys the premise of the show. Every tense moment, every claimed life or death scenario, and every supposed danger becomes meaningless. The threat is not real because the players never actually have to follow the rules the story insists are deadly. Sword Art Online pretends there is pressure, tension, and risk, but all of that evaporates the moment anyone uses basic logic. The so-called survival story does not exist. The show is built on the illusion of danger, and in reality, escaping is as easy as lifting a helmet. It is obvious the author did not do any research. The technology, the rules, and the mechanics of the death game are full of holes and inconsistencies that anyone with basic knowledge could spot. From the impossible nerve gear to revival items that appear and vanish without explanation, nothing in the story is grounded in reality or careful thought. The lack of research shows in how the world constantly contradicts itself. Survival should be difficult, stakes should be absolute, and danger should feel real, but none of this exists. Instead, the plot relies on hand-waving, convenient forgetfulness, and arbitrary rule changes to move the story along. This gives the series a careless, sloppy feel. Sword Art Online pretends to be about life or death survival, but the author clearly never bothered to figure out how such a world would actually function. The result is a story built on a shaky foundation that falls apart the moment you examine it. And in real life, an electromagnetic pulse would probably be enough to shut the nerve gear down entirely and remove it safely from the head of a player. The device depends on electronics to function. If those electronics stop working, the helmet becomes nothing more than dead plastic on the head of a player. That means the threat is not only flawed but laughably fragile. The entire death game hinges on technology that could realistically be disabled from the outside. Power loss, signal disruption, or hardware failure would instantly end the danger. So once again, the show tries to sell an unstoppable system when in reality it would be easy to shut down. The players are not trapped by an inescapable nightmare. They are trapped by a plot device that falls apart the moment real-world logic is applied. When your death game story has so many plot holes just based on the premise alone, and the actual story has not even begun, you know it is going to be a disaster. The foundation is already broken before a single scene of tension or action occurs. If the basic rules of survival do not make sense, nothing built on top of them can feel real or believable. Every supposedly high-stakes moment becomes meaningless because the audience already knows the threat is flawed. Logic and common sense tear through the illusion of danger before the story even starts. Characters are only in peril because the writers say they are, not because the world or technology actually forces it. A story that cannot hold up under its own premise is doomed from the start. Sword Art Online promises life or death stakes, but the holes in the setup guarantee that nothing will ever feel tense, serious, or credible. The disaster is baked into the concept itself. The most hilarious part is that in real life, Palmer Luckey, the founder of Oculus VR and designer of the Oculus Rift, actually tried to make a real version of the nerve gear, and he could not do it. The technology that Sword Art Online treats as terrifying and unstoppable is completely impossible with current science. This highlights just how absurd the premise is. The show sells the nerve gear as a device that can kill people instantly, yet in reality, even the brightest engineers cannot come close to making such a thing. The supposed danger exists only in fantasy. Sword Art Online pretends players are trapped by life or death technology, but real-world physics proves the entire concept is laughable. The story builds tension on something that could never exist, even if we ignore all the plot holes about the nerve gear and pretend that it somehow works perfectly as intended. The death game story is still not good at all. The main characters, especially Kirito, are so overpowered that they are never in any real danger of dying. No matter what happens, the story bends itself around them to keep them alive. This destroys any tension or suspense. If the audience knows the protagonist cannot truly be killed, every fight, every risky move, and every life or death scenario instantly becomes meaningless. Danger exists only for the side characters, while the heroes glide through the story unscathed. A true death game relies on uncertainty. Characters must be vulnerable, and death must be possible for anyone at any time. Sword Art Online fails here completely because the main cast is invincible by design. The show pretends there is risk, but for the people the audience is supposed to care about, there is none. It is like watching Superman participate in Squid Game. You would not feel any tension at all because you know he cannot die. Every challenge, every trap, every life or death scenario becomes meaningless when one character is invincible. Sword Art Online does the same thing with Kirito. No matter how dangerous the fight or how deadly the monsters seem, he is always going to survive. The audience cannot worry about him, and any suspense the story tries to create instantly falls flat. A death game only works if the outcome is uncertain. When the main character is untouchable, the stakes vanish. The story cannot make you fear for the life of anyone, and the so-called danger becomes nothing more than staged theatrics. Sword Art Online is not good, and it never was good. The story is built on a premise full of holes, inconsistencies, and abandoned ideas. The death game is optional. The rules keep changing, the main characters are overpowered, and the stakes are meaningless. Every attempt at tension, suspense, or drama falls flat because the show constantly undermines itself. Safety exists where it should not, deaths are avoidable or ignored, and the writers prioritize romance, slice-of-life moments, and rushed plotlines over survival. From the flawed nerve gear to the rushed floors, the ignored revival items, and the lack of real consequences, Sword Art Online fails at everything it claims to be. It pretends to be a high-stakes, gripping death game, but in reality, it is a story full of chaos, stupidity, and wasted potential. It is not good, and it never was. It is laughable how people say that Sword Art Online started off good and then got bad as it went on. No, it was never good to begin with. From the very first episodes, the so-called death game is already meaningless. The rules are inconsistent, and the story constantly prioritizes romance and slice-of-life nonsense over survival. The premise that is supposed to be tense and gripping is full of holes from day one. The safe zones exist, the nerve gear is flawed, revival items appear and vanish, and the main characters are untouchable. The tension, danger, and stakes that define a true death game never existed at all. Claiming the series started off good ignores all of this. Sword Art Online was flawed, shallow, and badly written from the start. It was never a compelling survival story, and no amount of early episodes can change that. There is no variety when it comes to the death game in Sword Art Online. The formula is always the same. Kill the boss, advance to a higher floor, and repeat. Every floor follows the exact same structure, making the story predictable and boring. Other death game stories know how to keep things fresh. In the Hunger Games franchise, for example, every death game is different, with new challenges, new rules, environments, and unpredictable dangers. That unpredictability creates real tension and suspense, because you never know what is coming next. Sword Art Online, by contrast, treats each floor like a checklist instead of a true survival challenge. The repeated formula makes every battle feel like a video game grind instead of a fight for life. The story pretends the stakes are high, but predictability and repetition kill any sense of danger or excitement. The death games in Alice and Borderland are all different, and each one tests something new. Some games test intelligence, some test physical skill, and others test teamwork, trust, or strategy. Every challenge feels unique and forces the characters to adapt or fail. This variety is exactly what Sword Art Online lacks. In Sword Art Online, every floor is just another boss fight with the same kill and move up formula. There is no creativity, no new type of challenge, and no way to test the players in different ways. By copying a single, repetitive formula for the entire game, Sword Art Online makes the death game feel shallow and mechanical. Unlike Alice in Borderland, there is no sense that players are being truly tested, pushed to their limits, or forced to grow. Every challenge is predictable, removing suspense and making the story feel flat. The boss fights in Sword Art Online should not even be that difficult. The show never states that there is a limit to how many players can fight a boss at once, which means, in theory, you could enter a battle with a party of thousands and completely overwhelm the enemy. This makes the supposed danger of the bosses meaningless. The show treats every fight as high stakes and life or death, but the mechanics allow for the problem to be trivially solved with sheer numbers. There is no strategy, risk, or real challenge required if everyone bands together. Sword Art Online pretends the bosses are deadly, but in reality, the system would make them easy to cheese. The tension, danger, and threat that define a proper death game are erased by rules that are never enforced and logic that is never considered. And what is with the sleeping mechanic? If this were a real game, players could just sleep in real life. There would be no need to rest or sleep inside the virtual world. The mechanic exists for no reason other than to pretend the game is more realistic than it actually is. This adds pointless restrictions without increasing tension or stakes. Instead of creating danger, it only wastes time and frustrates the audience. The story treats sleeping in-game like a necessity, but in reality, it does nothing to make survival harder or more meaningful. Sword Art Online piles on arbitrary mechanics like this to appear immersive, but they are illogical and unnecessary. Real players would ignore them entirely, and the survival story would be unaffected. It is just another example of the careless design of the series. Additionally, what is the point of letting players taste food and drink in Sword Art Online at all? It makes no sense. If this were a real game, players could just log out and eat real food in the real world or drink real drinks. There is no reason to copy taste when the real thing is right there and better in every way. It feels pointless and dumb, like the developers added it just to show off instead of thinking it through. The only time this idea works is if players are trapped inside the game and have no other choice. In that case, tasting food would matter because the game replaces real life. But Sword Art Online was not meant to be a death game at the start. The players were supposed to log in, play for fun, then leave. That makes the whole feature useless. It adds nothing, solves no problem, and only makes sense after the story forces the players to stay. Without that twist, the idea falls apart and looks poorly thought out. Adding taste and smell to every single food and drink in Sword Art Online would have cost a huge amount of extra money during development. That means more time, more workers, and more resources spent on something that players did not need. For a normal game, this would be a massive waste. Players could just log out and eat real food instead, so all that effort would be thrown away on a feature with no real purpose. It also does nothing to improve the death game aspect in any way. The danger comes from dying in the game, meaning death in real life, not from how realistic the food feels. Taste and smell do not raise the stakes, add tension, or make survival harder. They are just extra details that look fancy but change nothing. If anything, it makes the design feel careless, like money was burned on useless realism instead of things that actually matter. The writing in Sword Art Online is laughably bad. It fails at basic logic and then acts like it is being clever. A perfect example is Rosalia saying that nobody really knows if players actually die in real life when they die in the game. That idea is stupid on its face. It should be obvious to anyone paying attention that this is exactly what is happening. If players were not really dying, then people in the real world would have removed the nerve gears by now. Doctors, families, police, someone would have stepped in. The game would have been shut down and nobody would still be trapped inside. No sane person would keep letting thousands of players play the death game if the threat was fake. The fact that this has not happened proves the danger is real. Yet the show treats this like some big mystery, as if the truth is hard to figure out. It is not. You only need to think about it for more than 2 seconds. The writers pretend this is deep and shocking, but it just makes the story look careless and dumb. Anyone with half a brain can see the answer right away, which makes the characters and the writing look even worse. And the whole 2 episodes about the murder mystery in the safe zone were incredibly dumb. They were just pointless filler that added nothing to the story. Nothing important changes, no characters grow in a meaningful way, and the main plot does not move forward at all. It feels like the show completely stalls just to waste time. The mystery itself is weak and obvious, and the outcome does not matter once it is over. You could skip those episodes entirely and lose nothing of value. They do not raise the stakes, do not deepen the world, and do not make the death game more interesting. They are just there to pad the runtime, and it shows. The whole concept of the Laughing Coffin Guild is completely unrealistic. If players really die in real life when they die in the game, then killing someone in the game is straight up murder. Most players would never do that. Even the ones who might think about it would stop once they realize the consequences. People fight other players in games because it is fun and because nothing real is on the line. You lose, you respawn, and you move on. That is the whole point. The moment real death is involved, that mindset disappears. Most people would not even consider fighting another player if losing meant someone actually dies. The show tries to act like normal player behavior would stay the same, just with higher stakes. That is nonsense. Real death changes everything. Fear, guilt, and common sense would stop almost everyone. Treating deadly combat like normal game fun is not dark or edgy. It is just unrealistic and lazy writing. And what did these people think was going to happen later? The government already has a list of every player trapped in the game. Once the game ends, it would be incredibly easy to track them down. They would not be treated like edgy troublemakers from a video game. They would be arrested and thrown in jail for murder. There is no mystery there. The show acts like these players can just hide behind the idea that it was a game. It was not a game anymore. It was real life with real deaths. The idea that a whole guild would openly run around killing people without thinking about the fallout is ridiculous and makes the world feel fake and badly written. As you can see, Sword Art Online is an awful death game anime. It fails on every level that actually matters. The world makes no sense, the rules fall apart the moment you think about them, and the writing constantly ignores basic logic. The show wants to be taken seriously, but it never earns that respect. Its game mechanics are pointless, its danger is poorly thought out, and its characters act in ways that no real person would when their life is on the line. Instead of building tension, it relies on cheap drama and bad excuses. Nothing holds up under even light scrutiny. As a death game story, it is not just weak. It is a complete failure. There is literally nothing good about Sword Art Online. Not the writing, not the characters, not the world, and not the ideas. Every time it looks like it might do something interesting, it either backs out or ruins it with lazy logic and bad excuses. The show never improves. It just keeps repeating the same mistakes and pretending they are deep. You are more likely to find the actual One Piece than find a well-written moment in this godforsaken franchise. Any decent idea is wasted, rushed, or handled in the worst way possible. Emotional scenes feel fake, danger feels empty, and nothing has weight. It is not misunderstood or overhated. It is just bad, from start to finish. It is baffling how this dumpster fire became popular at all. Nothing about it earns that level of attention, and yet it somehow took off anyway. The success feels completely disconnected from the actual quality of the story, which is awful from top to bottom. If anything, its popularity is proof that popularity does not equal quality. A show can be poorly written, poorly thought out, and full of obvious flaws, and still attract a massive audience. Sword Art Online is a perfect example of that. It did not succeed because it was good. It succeeded in spite of how bad it is. Sword Art Online was never good, and it never will be good. It did not start strong, it did not fall from greatness, and it did not get ruined later. It was flawed from the very beginning and stayed that way. Every arc repeats the same problems with bad logic, weak writing, and empty ideas. There is no hidden masterpiece buried under the mess and no version of the story that suddenly works if you give it more chances. It had every opportunity to improve and wasted all of them. Calling it disappointing implies it once had promise. It did not. It was bad from day one and nothing is going to change that. Sword Art Online is an insult to MMO players, mythology fans, and basically anyone with half a brain. It gets games wrong, it gets stories wrong, and it gets its own rules wrong. Anyone who has actually played an MMO can see how fake and shallow the game design is. It does not understand how players act, how balance works, or why people enjoy these games in the first place. It is just as bad for mythology and fantasy fans. It borrows names, symbols, and ideas without caring what they mean or how they fit together. Everything feels cheap and surface level, like it was copied from a list with no thought behind it. The world has no depth and no respect for the things it is stealing from. Worst of all, it insults the intelligence of the viewer. The show expects people to ignore obvious problems, broken logic, and nonsense explanations. It treats basic thinking like it is too much to ask. If you stop and think for even a moment, the whole thing collapses. That is not clever writing. That is lazy writing that assumes the audience will not notice. If I ever assembled the Dragon Balls together, my wish would be to erase Sword Art Online from existence. Not for money, not for fame, and not for power. Just to make sure this franchise never existed in the first place. That alone would be a better and more noble use of a wish than anything else. The world would lose nothing of value. No great ideas would be gone, no well-written stories erased, and no meaningful characters missed. All it would do is spare people from sitting through hours of bad writing, broken logic, and wasted potential. One wish, one fix. The anime world would instantly be better without it. People who like Sword Art Online must have been born yesterday and never seen anything else. That is the only way it makes sense. Anyone with even a little experience watching anime or reading decent stories should be able to tell how bad it is right away. If this is impressive to them, then their standards are rock bottom. It reads like the first thing someone would enjoy before they discover shows with actual thought, effort, and competence behind them. Once you have seen anything better, there is no excuse for defending this mess. Liking it does not make someone deep or thoughtful. It just shows they do not know any better. The sad part is that Sword Art Online fans see me as the enemy. They act like I am a bad person just because I bash their favorite show. That reaction is laughable. Criticizing a badly written series is not a moral crime, no matter how much they want it to be. They take it personally because they tie their taste to their identity. Instead of defending the show with logic, they get angry and defensive. They treat criticism like an attack, not because it is unfair, but because they cannot handle hearing that something they like is bad. That says more about them than it does about me. I am not attacking them as people. I am attacking a bad show. If they cannot tell the difference, that is their problem. Acting like critics are villains, just for pointing out obvious flaws, is childish and embarrassing. But I guess that is what you should expect from Sword Art Online fans. A terrible show is bound to attract terrible fans. When the writing is weak and the logic is broken, the people defending it are not going to argue in good faith. They are going to lash out instead. They do not want discussion or criticism. They want praise and blind approval. Anyone who points out flaws gets labeled as hateful or mean because that is easier than admitting the show is bad. A fan base often reflects the quality of the work it defends, and in this case, the match is perfect. Sword Art Online fans really need to grow up and see the world as it really is. Liking a bad show does not make it good, and pretending criticism is evil does not change reality. Acting shocked when people point out obvious flaws is childish. At some point, they need to accept that taste is not the same thing as quality. You can enjoy something and still admit it is poorly written. Refusing to do that just makes them look immature and detached from reality. Defending a mess this hard is not passion. It is denial. Sword Art Online has the worst fanbase of all time. Forget Star Wars or K-pop. At least those fanbases can admit when something they like is flawed. Sword Art Online fans refuse to do even that. Any criticism, no matter how mild or logical, is treated like a personal attack. They defend bad writing like it is sacred text and react with anger instead of arguments. There is no discussion, no self-awareness, and no room for criticism. Everything is either blind praise or outrage. That level of denial is exhausting. A bad fanbase does not come out of nowhere. It grows around a bad product that trains people to accept lazy writing and broken logic as brilliance. Sword Art Online did exactly that, and its fanbase is the result. This fanbase is the definition of cringe. Everything about how they act is embarrassing, from the way they worship the show to how they melt down over the smallest criticism. They treat bad writing like it is sacred and act proud of defending it. There is nothing admirable about that. How do they even sleep at night knowing they spend so much energy defending something so poorly made? Instead of stepping back and thinking for a moment, they double down and get louder. It is secondhand embarrassment at its finest. Watching them argue feels less like a discussion and more like watching people flail around trying to protect a lost cause. Sword Art Online fans worship this terrible show the same way the ancient Greeks worshipped mythological gods like Zeus and Poseidon. They treat it like something sacred that must never be questioned. Any criticism is seen as heresy, no matter how fair or obvious it is. But even the ancient Greeks understood that their gods were flawed. They argued, failed, made mistakes, and caused problems. People could talk about those flaws openly. Sword Art Online fans, on the other hand, refuse to admit anything is wrong. To them, the show is perfect, untouchable, and beyond criticism. That is what makes it so absurd. A fictional anime is treated with more blind devotion than actual gods from mythology. At least those myths allowed room for thought and debate. This fanbase does not. They shut their brains off and clap, no matter how bad the writing gets. Sword Art Online being their gold standard is sad and pathetic. Of all the stories, worlds, and characters out there, this is what they hold up as the best. That says everything. It shows how low their standards are and how little effort they put into thinking about what makes a story good. Treating such a badly written mess as the peak of quality is embarrassing. It means broken logic, shallow characters, and lazy ideas are good enough for them. Instead of aiming higher, they cling to the first flashy thing they liked and refuse to move on. Calling this a gold standard is not loyalty. It is settling for garbage and pretending it is treasure.